there's old growth trail that we're going to go see. And we will be also beginning our tours of the Eugene Natural History Museum's garden. They have a native plant garden there, and we help the Natural History Museum do tours. So some of our members are there to help interpret. There will be dates April and May. I didn't get the June one in here because I'm not exactly sure of the date, but we'll get that to you. Just wanted you to know that there will be more than one if you miss the April one. And finally, I wanted everybody to know, get it on their calendars, that the Wildflower Show will be May 21st this year. We're working on a theme, and I think that information will be coming out here pretty quickly, but I think everybody will be really interested in seeing what that theme is. Let's see, we're looking for members interested in helping. Oh dear, I did not do a very good job of helping with field trip committee or communications committee. I found a typo. And then an e-ballot for our 2024 board is coming out in March. You'll get it in the mail, in the email. And I would like to thank everybody who agreed to volunteer for board and committee assignments. I know it takes up a lot of your time, and I very much appreciate everybody's help. We are going to be hosting the annual meeting for the state of Oregon. Here, the theme is going to be Botany in the Age of Community Science. The date is June 2nd to 4th. We'll have field trips Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, a meet and greet at Wildcraft Cider Works Friday night, and a banquet at Venue 242 on Saturday night. And finally, a state board meeting on Sunday at LCC. So we hope to see some of you join us there. Okay, and the last thing is during our program, we'd like for you to post your questions in the chat, and keep your sound off so we don't hear your dogs barking in the background, or your kids or whoever else might be in the house. We'll open up for questions at the end of the program, but keep posting the questions in the chat as they come up. And at the end, I think Stephen or I will read them off for Christine to address. And then thank you for supporting the Native Plant Society and coming tonight. We really appreciate it. Our programs are going to be posted to the YouTube site, the ones that are on Zoom. So that link can be found at our website also, and I'll put that in the chat. So with that, I'm going to pass on to Angela.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jenny, and thanks to everybody who joined us tonight. We're really excited. I'm Angela Soto. I'm just currently serving as the co-chair of the Emerald Chapters Program Committee, along with Gail Baker. And tonight, we are welcoming the wonderful Christine Buhl to present on the Emerald Ashborer. Christine is a graduate of Oregon State University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has served as an entomologist from Hawaii to the country of Lebanon on projects spanning from public health to chemical ecology. She currently serves as the state forest entomologist with the Oregon Department of Forestry, where she provides statewide technical assistance to public and private landowners and monitors forest health via aerial and ground surveys. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Christine, if you want to share your screen.
Okay. Let me share that. All right, are you seeing the full screen slide? Okay, great. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak with your group. We really rely on folks that have their eyes on the ground, that are actively looking and can first detection, such as this one that we found. Emerald ash borer is an exotic insect that we detected for the first time in Oregon. Oh, I'm sorry.
On presenter view.
It's not on presenter view?
Oh, you want it on, so it was on
No,
presenter.
I just want to show the slide. Let me try that again.
On the teacher view or the.
There we go. I need to select screen two. Okay, how's it looking now? Great. Okay. All right. So I wanted to basically share some information with you as people that are actually looking around outside and can spot these insects, because that's often how they're first found on the landscape, is that somebody actually sees them rather than them coming to traps. And so this insect is an exotic insect that's kind of swept through eastern states, and this is the first detection that we've had in the west side of the US, and it's the first one west of Colorado. So it's pretty important. And I want you to be thinking, if you aren't already aware of emerald ash borer and what it does and the impacts that it has, it's going to be similar to Dutch elm disease or chestnut blight, in which it basically kills all of the host tree that it's looking for. And for this insect, it's ash trees. So this is something we were well aware of. All the agencies were working in advance, preparing for it. We assumed it was a matter of time because it's never been eradicated, that it would get to our state. So we have had a lot of plans in place, but I'm going to start with just telling you a little bit of background about the insect, the damage that it causes, how you can diagnose whether a tree might have been infested by this insect, where to report it, and then how the agencies are actually pulling together and how we're responding to this issue and how we can go forward. But a lot more information is going to be coming through via different media outlets. But this is kind of a first summary overview of what we found in this past year, since this past summer when we first detected this insect. So I'm with Oregon Department of Forestry, but this is a multi-agency effort. The lead agency is Oregon Department of Agriculture. But we're also working with the Forest Service, APHIS, all the city and county and park services, all of the smaller municipalities. We've all pulled together to work on this issue. So we first detected emerald ash borer on June 30th, 2022. We basically got a call from a City of Portland employee that mentioned that he saw some symptoms and some insects flying around, and it looked suspiciously like emerald ash borer. This person definitely knows what emerald ash borer is, so it was not a call I wanted to get on a Friday on a holiday weekend. But I went out and took a look, and he was indeed right. It was emerald ash borer. These trees were heavily infested. This is a school parking lot. You can see all those trees that are thinning. This is the middle of summer, but they were in various stages of being dead or dying. And they had been infested probably for at least 3 years, judging by the level of infestation. Once I started peeling the bark back and looking at all those larval galleries, it was a very high level of infestation. So we reported this to Oregon Department of Agriculture and APHIS, and then they were able to confirm it was emerald ash borer, and it kind of activated the plan that we had already established. And I'll get into diagnosing the signs and symptoms in just a minute. But this location is in Forest Grove, Oregon. That's in Washington County. We have not had any detections outside of the Washington County region as of yet, but we are actively looking. So a little background about the presence and movement of emerald ash borer. So this is an exotic insect. It's from parts of Asia and parts of Russia, so Far East, and it was first detected in 2002 in Detroit, Michigan. However, it was likely there for some years before it was identified. And that's very common with invasives, that they can establish in an area sometimes for years until their damage becomes devastating enough that we can actually detect it. So very common. They think that it actually was found previous to that in Canada, but then it worked its way through into Michigan, and it jumped from state to state. It actually jumped a quarantine that was around the Mississippi River border, a little bit west of that. But there was a quarantine that was established by APHIS in which no ash material was supposed to move from that quarantine. However, emerald ash borer was detected in 2013 in Colorado. So it had moved from east to west, jumping that quarantine, likely through firewood. So the way that the insect first gets here is usually through overseas transports and products that we're purchasing, but then it moves from state to state via things like firewood. That's very common, sometimes nursery stock. So from 2002, when it's first detected in the United States, then in 2019, it reached 33 states. It's now in 36 states. It was detected in Oregon in 2022. So the pathways, as I mentioned, typically the first entry into the US is via shipments and cargo containers. It can be in pallets or other wood products. Various types of wood products can host a variety of different insects, particularly wood-boring beetles, such as emerald ash borer. And so that's typically how they get into the country. And then they move from state to state via typically nursery stock and firewood. And a lot of insects move this way. And there are massive inspections that take place at ports. In some states, they actually do have some quarantine areas and areas that they are inspecting, but there's nowhere near enough people to inspect all of the products that are moving. We have a lot of things traveling via commerce, and it's really hard to find everything. We do find a fair bit, but a lot of things do slip through the cracks, but we're always still looking. So our advisory is always to prevent interstate or interstate travel is to not move firewood, be wary of moving nursery stock, but we know that there are some complications to that. So this is an image showing all of the ash mortality in one area from emerald ash borer, and this happens pretty quickly. Within a few years, a tree can die from emerald ash borer infestations. And so all the trees without leaves that you're seeing in this image are ash trees, and all the other green trees are not ash trees. So this area was depleted of ash from emerald ash borer, and it's been estimated that there's about 95% or more mortality in ash in areas that have been infested by emerald ash borer. The only reason it's not 100% is because we have not found resistance, but there are some systemic insecticide treatments that can protect a tree preventatively. So there are some methods to protect ash on our landscape. They are laborious and they are expensive, but they might be something that you might want to think about for some heritage trees or some key ash trees that you want to retain. So since the finding of emerald ash borer, over 100 million trees have been killed in over 30 states. Now this says since the 1990s, even though we first found it in 2002, because it's estimated kind of dating back that the insect actually arrived here way before 2002. And then, as I mentioned, the insect has never been successfully eradicated. Many states have tried and failed. It's very expensive. That is not our goal. In Oregon, we have learned a lot from these other states. We've learned what works and what doesn't. What we're working on is slowing the spread. What that does is it buys us time to spread out our expenses for removal and replacement of trees and determine how to destroy trees. And it also buys us time for other efforts such as biocontrol, resistance trials, of all of which we are pursuing currently. So we just need a little bit more time rather than just kind of letting the insect run rampant across the state. And so this insect is going to pose a very high economic and ecological cost. So this is one image of Toledo, Ohio. So in 2006, there's a ash-lined street in a suburban neighborhood on the left, and then just 3 years later, all of those ash were killed by emerald ash borer. So this is obviously not just an aesthetic issue, but all these trees are islands of habitat, ecological niches that we desperately need, especially in our urban areas. And so it's lowering property values in addition to being an eyesore and ecologically damaging. But also, if you think about communities that maybe don't have the funds to cover replacement of these trees, it's going to be particularly damaging for some of those cities or some of those neighborhoods, or the single landowner that maybe they have 1 or 2 ash trees in their yard and they lose them and can't afford to replace them. So that's going to be of a high economic cost to those people. So it's been estimated that about 5% of the street trees in Portland are ash trees. A lot of these are green ash. They're not our native Oregon ash, but we do have some native Oregon ash planted ornamentally as street trees. But we have about 5% of our trees that are these trees. So the estimated cost, if we were to have to remove and replace all those trees, is upwards of $50 million. So that is a large cost. It possibly could be a cost that Portland can burden. But again, looking at communities and cities and towns that maybe do not have the funding resources to be able to pay for that, this is going to be economically damaging for those areas to replace these trees. So ash is typically found in areas that you would expect, if you know a bit about ash, and I'm guessing this group does, that it's found typically in riparian areas, areas where we have some source of moisture. So not a lot found east of the Cascades. However, there are pockets in some areas that often have ephemeral springs. So ash is a very unique species in that it can withstand some part of the year in dry soil and some part of the year in wet soil. So you can have wet feet and dry feet. And that's a really unique trait that we don't have very many other species, and no native species that can really withstand that and fulfill that tree canopy. So we're really struggling with what do we replace ash with in some of these areas that have those two extreme conditions at that site. But OSU is working on a publication on guidance for certain things that can be planted in some of those areas, but we may need to step beyond the natives and think about some other species that we might want to put into some of those areas. Obviously, wherever we can, we want to retain natives, especially in the ecological areas, but we just may not have tree species that can actually withstand some of these really extreme conditions, especially as ongoing hot droughts persist. So Oregon ash, Fraxinus latifolia is typically what I'm talking about here, but we do have a variety of non-native ash that are present, particularly as street trees, but we're really focused at Oregon Department of Forestry on our native ash tree. It is a vital component of a lot of our riparian areas. It provides shading, bank stabilization, habitat for threatened and endangered species. There's a huge influx of material that is dropped from the tree at the end of the season when the leaves drop into the water that provides a food source for a lot of the macroinvertebrates and other creatures that are living there. And so it's really essential in those ecological niches. It's not as essential as a wood product in Oregon. It's less commonly utilized as a wood product versus in the East where they make fats and matches, et cetera. But we do have some smaller mills that make flooring and other products out of ash trees, and it's a vital cultural resource. So we are actually trying to work with the tribes on figuring out if we can allocate some of our sanitized infested ash towards the tribes so that they can utilize them for canoe paddles and other products. So we are working on a way to facilitate that so that there's no cost to the tribes to be able to access that wood. So this is a really common site, especially in the Willamette Valley, that you'll be driving down I-5 and there's agricultural areas all around you, but you'll see these pockets of tree habitat, and these little islands oftentimes are 100% ash trees. You get into those canopies, underneath those canopies, and it's 100% ash. And so if all those ash trees are lost, you're faced with having things like sedges or maybe some understory brushes or woody perennials, for example, that can take over that area, but you don't have that tree cover, and it's changing the functioning of that ecosystem. And so that's something we're particularly worried about, losing those islands of ash habitat. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on this because I'm sure you all are aware, but I do like to cover what an ash tree is to identify it, because we do not want a lot of false reports on, I think this tree has been infested with emerald ash borer, can you come look at it? And then it's not even an ash tree. So we really want to make sure that we're only hearing about ash trees. I will discuss a little bit that emerald ash borer can actually infest other members of Oleaceae, the olive family, so cultivated olive fringe tree, but it really prefers ash. That's what it prefers to feed on. That's what the young develop on best. It really does prefer ash in all the feeding trials. And once all the ash are gone, it may then rely on some of those other hosts, but that's many, many, many years from now. It really does want ash. And in feeding trials amongst the different, I think 16 ash species found across the nation, it really does well on Oregon ash, unfortunately for us. So ash has a compound leaf, so a bunch of little leaflets on one leaf stem. rather than just a single leaf on that leaf stem. There's anywhere from 5 to 11, depending upon the 5 to 11 little leaflets on that stem, depending upon the type of ash that you were talking about. The one shown in the picture is Oregon ash. And then it has opposite branching instead of alternating branching. So it's just kind of the branches are right across from each other. Even when the leaves have dropped, it's really easy to identify ash in the distance, just seeing that perfectly symmetrical branching. And then as the tree ages, the bark typically takes on a lattice or a diamond-shaped pattern, and then it has a single winged seed, a samara. Unlike a maple seed that is 2 wings, it's just that single wing of a seed. Oh, these are the arrows to show you what I'm talking about, but sure you all are well aware of all those features of Oregon ash and ash trees in general. We do have some other species that can be confused with ash. However, none of them are in tree form, at least not the natives. Elderberry is the closest one that's easy to confuse. However, it's typically in bush form. But most of these other species is pretty easy to disentangle, even if they have compound leaves or opposite branching. So to identify emerald ash borer, so this insect, first of all, is native to Eastern Asia, as I mentioned, in parts of Russia. It is a wood boring type of beetle, but it's more similar if you're familiar with bronze birch borer, which is native, unlike emerald ash borer. These beetles don't actually dive deep into the wood. They actually just go right underneath the bark, and they might etch in the sapwood a little bit, but they don't really dive really deep into the wood. This actually makes them more damaging because the wood-boring beetles that dive deeper, they typically get into heartwood, and those are tissues that aren't actively functioning. They're not part of the vascular system that's actively translocating water and nutrients. And so what they're doing is just hanging out underneath the bark and just cutting across cambium and phloem and cutting off those tissues. So they're girdling the tree. It's the larva that's doing this. So the insect will lay an egg on the outside of the tree. It hatches into a larva, and the larva burrows into underneath the bark, and it makes these winding S-shaped galleries, pupates, and then it will emerge as an adult. They mate and they start the cycle again. And as mentioned, they definitely prefer ash trees, but they will also attack other members of the olive family, such as cultivated olive and fridge tree. Nowhere in the country have they seen devastating impacts of emerald ash borer in those other species. It's primarily been in ash, but mainly because they haven't totally run out of ash, or they don't have a lot of olive that the insect could then move to. So we are still worried about them getting into olive, especially as that industry is kind of burgeoning in the Willamette Valley. So I talked a little bit about the life cycle here. Typically, it's about a 1-year life cycle. It can be 2 years in colder climates where it just spends a bit more time underneath the bark, but we expect pretty much statewide, it's going to be about a 1-year life cycle. And it goes from egg to adult in that span of the year. Typically, this insect will have some timing that they'll wake up when it starts warming up. The adults will emerge and wake up when it starts warming up. And then the colder season, they'll be under that bark as larva or pupa. Now, the exact timing of when that's going to happen in Oregon, we aren't sure of, because we have not had a full year to kind of watch that cycle to see, is it May, July? Is it right at the beginning of May that adults emerge, or is it later in June? We're not quite sure for Oregon yet. We can only kind of glean what we've seen in other states that have similar type of climates, but we really aren't certain yet, and we'll be tracking that starting with this spring. So just to give you a quick and dirty ID on emerald ash borer. Now, we do have a lot of insects that look similar to emerald ash borer, but it does have some really distinct key features. So I'm going to go back a little bit and show you that size again. So it's a very small insect. As entomologists, we always like to show really big blown up images of insects. We always have to show you how big it actually is in real life, because they're often far smaller than it would appear in presentation. So if you look at that penny, it's about 1/2 to 3/4 the width of the penny. So about 1/2 inch is typical, but there is some variation in that size. They're a very slender insect. So that top picture is emerald ash borer. The one below it is the one we most commonly get reports about that is not emerald ash borer. And that's a native insect, the golden bee crested, very common, widespread, not a pest. but they're very different looking when you see them side by side. So emerald ash borer is much shorter. It's far more narrow, so it's a more slender insect, but more importantly, it's all over green. There are no color variations there. There's no other colors, ridges, spots, stripes. It's plain green. It has kind of a sparkly sheen. Sometimes it can be a bit more drab green, but it's going to be all over green, no other colors, and a very smooth surface. And so the Oregon Department of Agriculture has a great lookalikes key that I'm showing you here below, but I will actually provide a PowerPoint or a PDF of this PowerPoint to you guys so that you actually have the links for all the resources I'm showing you, and one of which is that lookalike guide. That link is in there. So the first thing to look at if you're trying to determine if you might have an emerald ash borer infestation is first, is it an ash tree? Make sure it's an ash tree, and then you want to be looking for the typical external signs and symptoms of emerald ash borer. So does it have a thinning crown or top kill or epicormic shoots at the base or anywhere along the trunk? Bark splits from the insect working its way underneath the bark, girdling the tree. It separates that bark from the tree, and so the bark will actually split open sometimes. Woodpeckers come along and they can hear the insect moving around in the bark or in the wood, and so they'll shave off that bark, and so you'll see these lighter patches where the woodpecker has been working. And then D-shaped exit holes, and these exit holes are very small. They are about the width of if you were to take a pencil eraser and cut it in half. It's kind of a half moon shape. Now, not every hole is perfectly D-shaped, but typically if you see an ash tree that has these symptoms of looking like it's in decline, and then you see a whole bunch of, especially if they're clustered, a whole bunch of whole exit holes that look like they're D-shaped, that's a pretty clear indication it's likely emerald ash borer. We don't ask that you take the next step in peeling the bark back and looking for larvae or looking for those galleries. Leave that up to us, but if you see these symptoms, we definitely want to know about it, and I have the link later as to where you can report that. There are a lot of different things that can be confused with emerald ash borer. So the insect itself can be confused with a lot of different things. There are a lot of different insects that burrow into ash trees and can leave exit holes. So you really want to look at kind of all of these signs and symptoms together. Do you see the results of the tree dying back and those exit holes that at least some of them will look a little bit D-shaped, they're the appropriate size? Really take all of those things into account. There are a lot of insects that will get into these trees and cause exit holes that are not damaging to the trees at all. And one other caveat is that in addition to emerald ash borer, there are a lot of things that attack ash trees. At the end of the season, late summer, the leaves usually look pretty shabby. A lot of insects are feeding on the leaves and they'll drop the leaves. And that's typical for a lot of deciduous trees. They drop the leaves and the buds will still make it the next season and they'll reflush as normal. It's not a problem. But we've also been enduring ongoing hot droughts that have been really persistent, really frequent, and really intense. And so ash trees have also been suffering from that drought stress, which unfortunately looks very similar to EAB infestation because they're essentially doing the same thing. Either the tree doesn't have enough moisture and so it's dropping leaves, or it's getting girdled because it can't translocate enough moisture because of emerald ash borer, and so it's dropping leaves. So that's why that symptom looks very similar. So as I mentioned, we were prepared for this. We knew it was a matter of time. I was hoping I'd be retired before we found emerald ash borer here, but no such luck. So this is a multi-agency effort. I did not include OSU when I mentioned all the agencies, but OSU has done a large chunk of this work, but we're all pulling together. We actually already had a plan in place for when this was going to happen, so we all knew what our role was going to be. So part of the preparation that we did before we found emerald ash borer was we did have a trapping survey for many years. We used these big purple prism traps. That's the bottom right picture. You may have seen some hanging in ash trees that multiple agencies hung them to try and detect emerald ash borer, kind of an early detection. These traps aren't great because emerald ash borer really wants to go after the tree rather than the traps. And so it's not common that that's the first detection of emerald ash borer is in those traps. They're also sticky, they're a mess, they're wasteful. You can only use them for one season. So we really don't like to rely on those. What we really do rely on is eyes on the ground. And so that's what I'm doing here this evening, trying to share this information that you can share with others, and even better, to dispel misinformation. So now you know what emerald ash borer looks like. So if somebody mentions, I found an insect and it looks kind of like this, and you see it and it doesn't look right, you can share that information. So we're really hoping that the information spreads. We also had a course called the Oregon Forest Pest Detectors course that OSU put together with ODA and ODF, where we trained over 500 professionals, and it's ongoing. It's arborists, landscapers, anybody that's outside working with trees. We wanted to train them on how to detect emerald ash borer and a few other pests, so that they would be the first ones to detect it and inform us. And that's indeed how this happened, that we were notified by somebody that had a hand in that effort. And so that is an ongoing training that's available online. It's free unless you're looking for SAF credits or some other credits. You can take it anytime you want. It's always available on the OSU site. And I will link to that later. We also had a response plan, as I mentioned, that all the agencies knew what their role would be and how they would show up, and they have done so. So we have that clearly laid out in that response plan, which is also available online for you to view. It's very general, because now we are at the point where we're drilling down to the specifics, and that's something you can only do once it arrives, once you know where it is, what type of habitat it's in, what your resources are. And so we are following that up. That response plan was meant to be just kind of a starting point. And perhaps most importantly, we also had an ash seed collection effort where over 1 million seeds were collected statewide from Oregon ash to preserve the genetic diversity of Oregon ash on our landscape. So those were collected by ODF, and the U.S. Forest Service is retaining them in a repository. So they're going to be retained in cold storage for conservation, but also for resistance trials. So hopefully we can find some sort of resistance and put ash out on our landscape, or retain it in a lot of areas. Now, be advised, resistance can take many, many years and sometimes is never found, but we're definitely going to give it a shot, and we at least will preserve the genetic diversity of ash so that we can keep outplanting it in some areas where we can actively protect it, such as by using systemic insecticide. Now, once we found emerald ash borer, our responses were pretty comprehensive as well. So there is a temporary quarantine that began right after Thanksgiving. It's a 180-day quarantine for all of Washington County. No ash trees or ash material can leave that area without being sanitized. And I do have a link to more details about that. Now, it is a temporary quarantine because we need to figure out what to do next. What's our next step? Because Washington County has a lot of nurseries and a lot of areas that are growing ash, using for restoration efforts and et cetera. And we really don't want to hurt those industries any more than needed. So we are trying to work with them as well and figure out what our next steps are after that quarantine. We are actively monitoring for new infestations. Multiple agencies are on the ground mapping. We found 40 infested trees thus far. I think several hundred, if not closer to 1,000 or more, have actually been checked out and are being monitored. We do have an active dashboard that I also believe I have a link at the end that you can see where new detections are popping up. But we have some detections that need to be verified by the folks at ODA before they're fully active as an active infestation area. So if you see a little red dot pop up in Medford, look the next day or next couple days, it may not be red again because we need to verify that. And we also have active, I did mention the biocontrol. So we are establishing biocontrol sites. And this spring, we're going to apply 2 WASP biocontrol agents to go after the emerald ash borer. These are very effective biocontrol agents. But again, they do not eradicate. They only reduce the population, which helps slow the spread. So just one of the many tools we're utilizing. And we do have a bunch of subcommittees made up of all the different agencies that are involved to basically do this active survey and monitoring, keeping our eyes on the ground, figuring out what are we going to do with the infested material, how can we utilize that wood, or how can we destroy it, providing more training and technical assistance, integrated pest management, what are our options for control, including biocontrol, insecticides, et cetera. bunch of research projects, including resistance trials, communication. It's been very active in the media for sharing this information out and looking for funding, especially to support communities that cannot afford this great expense. So a little bit about prevention and treatment. So first, just take stock of your ash trees. Which ones are ash trees? How many do you have? And monitor their health. If you start seeing some thinning canopies or some top kill, you should act quickly because emerald ash borer does. When you know that the next county over has emerald ash borer, you should take some active, proactive management steps in terms of determining if you want to start applying insecticide or planning for what replacement trees are going to go in that tree's place, how you're going to get rid of those trees if they get infested. Now realize healthy ash trees will still die, but they'll die less quickly. So the ones that are already stressed, they're putting off a stress chemical that's actually very inviting to emerald ash borer, and they can be detected very quickly. Unfortunately, these ongoing droughts have stressed all of our trees. But the trees that are the healthiest are going to be able to withstand emerald ash borer infestation longer. We are advising to not plant ash. If you do, it's up to you, but recognize that that may be a temporary ash tree that you have. And then there are products such as emamectin benzoate that can be applied as an injection treatment, systemic treatment, that are quite effective. This product in particular lasts 3 years, very effective for prevention. It's not advised to utilize it once the tree has been infested. That's likely going to be a waste of money, but recognize if you treat the tree, that's an ongoing commitment. So you could treat a tree for 15 years and then you decide to skip a treatment for a year or two, and that's when emerald ash borer attacks the tree, and it may be too late to save the tree. We also advise not to move firewood more than 10 miles. That's the average spread of an infestation. There is a lot of variability there, but that perimeter of an infestation area typically spreads 10 miles a year. So we are advising not to move firewood any more than 10 miles. I would say just don't move any ash firewood. It's pretty easy to look at the bark and determine if it definitely is not ash, utilize that firewood. And then if you do have infested material, it needs to be treated. So it needs to be chipped or masticated, or it can be kiln dried. So 60 for 60 is kind of the rule of thumb, and that's 60 minutes at 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Or it can be incinerated. It can be utilized for biochar and other products. There is also fumigation, but we don't suggest it. It's very toxic and very expensive. But there, at that link below, there are a lot more details about some of these different types of preventative and treatment methods that can be utilized. So while OSU is trying to come up with a document on what species can be planted to replace ash, they're going to be leaning on things like this from Shoals Valley Native Nursery. If it's a wetter site, maybe lean towards these species versus a drier site, lean towards these species. But I will say of all of these native species, there really is no one-to-one replacement for Oregon ash in some areas. Areas that face the extreme dry and extreme wet at the same site really don't have a lot of tree options that are native. But OSU is working on a document, and it likely will be at this link here. However, it may be at a different link, and I'll have to update that down the road. So in summary, currently emerald ash borer has only been detected in Washington County. Infestations can spread about 10 miles a year, but there's some variation of that, some less, some more. We do advise to avoid planting ash, but please do monitor ash for signs and symptoms of infestation and report them to us. Please, please include the image and location. We are tracking a lot of different reports. We don't have a lot of staff from all the agencies to follow up on everything. So that's really going to help us to include an image and location. And please do look at the lookalikes. Make sure it's an ash tree. Make sure it's as close to an emerald ash borer that it's not one of the other lookalikes. And do note that the adult is not often seen outside the tree. It's just a few short months and typically flying in the canopy. So it's not very common that you'll just walk along and you'll see an emerald ash borer nicely placed on the outside of a tree unless there's a very massive infestation. So typically you're going to look for those other signs and symptoms. So here are all the resources that I mentioned, where to report it, the lookalikes, and then a few other guidance documents, a little bit of background on emerald ash borer. a link to the table of all the insecticides that are labeled in Oregon to utilize for emerald ash borer, our plan, and then that Oregon Forest Pest Detector training. And I believe that's my last slide. So I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. And I see one question in the.
Sorry, Christine, I was on mute. I can help out. There are some questions.
I can read.
Okay. There are some questions in the chat. Maybe we should go back to the beginning question just because everyone can't see the chat if they join later. So.
Okay. The first question was, what kind of chemistry makes ash borer back sparkle? So that's really more of a factor of reflectance, just light reflectance, like what rays are, what part of the spectrum is absorbed versus reflected. So not really a chemical interaction, or it's really just reflectance of light. And then the next one was about the lichens. And I don't think, let's see.
Yeah, I can read it for you if you like.
Sure, if you'd like.
Okay. So speaking of lichen diversity at Mount Pisgah, I have heard that white ash harbor the greatest diversity of epiphytes among trees in Oregon. What are the implications giving emerald ash borer?
Yeah, there are varied implications that we're not quite sure of, especially because a lot of the states that have been infested with emerald ash borer out east and have very different ecosystems than we do. They have different types of ash, so they would have different types of epiphytes. Obviously, there's going to be cascading issues with whenever you lose a species on the landscape. So there's going to be a loss to nutrient cycling, ecological functioning, food sources for insects, and then food sources for the prey or predators that feed on insects, for example. That's just one string of examples. There are a lot of implications because there are cascading effects whenever you lose a species, but we don't really know how bad they will be. And so our research subcommittee is going to tackle those types of questions. But this is going to be basically a forever issue. We are never going to eradicate emerald ash borer. It's always going to be on the landscape. So we're going to see a lot of different things as time goes on.
Thank you. So the next question was about the biological controls, which I believe you answered in regards to the wasp, but we have another question from Tanya. Are the wasps considered for biocontrol native to Oregon?
Yes, there are two wasps, and no, they are not. This is classical biocontrol, so they are from where emerald ash borer is from. However, they have been studied and utilized for years, and so there are no major non-target impacts. They can feed on other wood-boring beetles, other Agrylus species in the Agrylus genus. However, they really tend to target emerald ash borer because they co-evolved with emerald ash borer. They can readily recognize emerald ash borer, and they're so good at finding EAB that sometimes there are monitoring projects that are aimed to find the wasp instead of emerald ash borer, because the wasps are outside of the trees and easier to find. So wherever you find concentrations of those wasps, you know there's EAB in that area. So they're really tuned in to finding emerald ash borer. And since they're so used to emerald ash borer, that's what they're going to go for first versus everything else. So we have not seen fallout from applying this biocontrol agent in other states where it's been utilized. And we're trying it at two sites just to start. So it's not going to be widely cast. It's a small start.
Great. And there's another question that came in. Do the systematic insecticides have off-target impacts on other insects that feed on the trees?
So anything can have non-target impacts. There are a lot of products that are in insecticides that are not listed on the label because they're not an active ingredient. So some things that make them stickers or spreaders or help them hang around and have a longer residual times. A lot of those things are not on the label and don't have to be tested. And so there's always a potential for non-target impacts. The major products that are used, such as emamectin benzoate, which is pretty toxic. Emamectin benzoate does impact other beetles that will be in the tree, other insects that are in the tree. So it is a broad spectrum insecticide. There will be non-target impacts in terms of killing other insects other than emerald ash borer. So you really do need to be judicious in its use and weighing how important is it to retain this ash tree versus applying an insecticide to that tree that could also kill a whole host of insects that also reside within that tree. It does help that it's a systemic that is injected into the tree. I would avoid products that are soil drenches or granules, etc., because they are not trapped in the tissue of the tree as well as an injectable is. But even with an injectable, it can travel to nectar, pollen. Now, even though ash is wind pollinated, there are a variety of bee species that will actually utilize a lot of different wind pollinated trees for their pollen, their resins, etc., just kind of on a one-off basis or occasionally, and they can be impacted as well. So you really need to weigh what products you're utilizing, and then what time of year you utilizing them. So if you apply them after a flowering period, there's a lower impact to pollinators, for example. So really weigh what you're utilizing, how important it is to treat that tree versus just replace that ash.
Great. Another question came in from Bob. Are there any known instances of emerald ash borer resistance to, if I'm pronouncing this, emamectin benzoate?
Emamectin benzoate, yeah, not as of yet. There's always a possibility, but this product has been used for decades out in eastern states, and they have not found resistance as of yet. But it has not been used a ton because it is expensive to use that. But there have been trees that have been, that for decades, they have had emamectin benzoate applied, and they have not found any evidence of resistance for emerald ash borer.
All right, so any other questions for Christine? You're welcome to also just go off of mute and ask a question.
Yeah, I was kind of curious if the herbicide treatments are so expensive, in what case are people using the herbicides?
So it's insecticide, not an herbicide.
Insecticide, yes.
Yeah. You know, typically it's a heritage tree. So it could be like a really big older ash that you want to protect on your front yard, and it provides a lot of shade and it's been there for years. That's a very common application target that I often saw out east. It can also be utilized sometimes even in riparian areas where you really want to retain that riparian habitat. There are different rules depending upon if it's zoned agriculture versus forestry, for example. In forestry, we do have some exemptions for forest health. And so again, weighing, is it more important to retain this riparian area than the risks of applying this insecticide? So it's a case-by-case basis, but typically it's a heritage tree that would take a really long time to replace that shade, habitat, the bank stability, etc. But it can be expensive. It's a long-term deal. I had heard that the minimums out in Forest Grove actually treated their ash trees. So they've actually had the funds to be able to treat some of their trees in their parking lots, for example. Some cities might opt to do that rather than they'll kind of weigh the cost of maybe treat them for a few years to buy themselves time to replace those trees with different species, for example.
Okay, so you wouldn't see them used in wildland situations?
We might, but it would be a bit more rare because it would be so expensive, so many trees to treat, and then you really want to weigh what are the costs of treating with that insecticide versus replacing it with a different species.
Okay.
Any other questions for Christine? So Christine, I want to thank you for your time this evening, and
yeah, thank you.
We'll be posting this on our YouTube channel, or if you want to recommend this talk or listen to it again. And if you please be sure to send Jenny the PDF, because we'll share some of that information at our tables at our upcoming programs. Yeah.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and yeah, keep your eyes peeled and let us know if you see anything.
Will do.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.